Now, many readers do escape that corner, and they recognize Agamemnon's name, and at least in an increment, they turn around and they correct their mistake by reframing the one previous line before. The broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. But they go no further than that. They reframe one line, they turn back around and finish the poem. Now granted, reframing the rest of the poem, the parts that have never undergone reframe before, is an easier task said than done, without a doubt. But the difficulty of a task, especially a worthy task, should not dissuade us from pursuing it. And so, with Agamemnon's name and the Trojan world in mind, we must now attempt not only to refrain the 9th line, but then also the 8th. And so if we know that the broken wall, the burning roof and tower is now a depiction of the wall of Troy crumbling and flamed on fire after the soldiers have leapt out of the horse in the middle of the night, then we must ask ourselves, with this same image in mind, what shudder and what loins engendered there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and ultimately Agamemnon dead? This is the next line back that has never been reframed by any critic in the last 100 years. A shudder in the loins engenders there the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, and Agamemnon dead. Now again, we must take ourselves out of the text world of Leda that we had previously created, in where this shudder and these loins are between two people or things. We must sort of set that interpretation aside and clear our minds, and then pack it full of the Trojan War scene and all its details that we can think of. And once we've done that, only then should we ask ourselves, what shudder and what loins engendered there that destruction? What shudder and what loins engendered there that destruction? Once the reader is set out to imagine this scene and all that may be there, an answer is found in the midst of it all. You see, right there, across the Ionian plain that has been stomped dead by warring feet over the last 10 years, up the crumbling wall that was disassembled so that they could pull the Trojan horse into the city because it was too big for the front doors. Down beneath the burning roofs that have been set ablaze by the enemy, in the midst of all the chaos, stands the Trojan horse, empty, watching everything crumble around it. The Trojan horse hides in plain sight within this poem, hiding in plain sight as it is famed for doing all this time past. So with this horse in mind, we have to ask ourselves, what shudder in what loins engenders the destruction here? Now this point takes me back to something that I said earlier about how scholars commonly interpret these lines, and that they suggest that Yeats was sort of prophesizing when he structured his meaning this way, and that poetically Yeats was suggesting that when Zeus impregnated Leda, it somehow looked forward to all the destruction that would come by her bloodline, by the birth of Helen and the drama that would unfold in Troy. And as I said, it's a very compelling explanation, and I like it. And I like it because while thinking about it, while thinking about the impregnation of Leda by Zeus the swan, and thinking about how he engenders or deposits himself, I'm reminded of the Trojan Horse, and I'm reminded of a shudder in the loins of the Trojan Horse that engendered there into the city of Troy the broken wall, the burning roof and tower. And so similarly to how Zeus affects Leda, victimizes her, colonizes her maybe even, similar to that process is the same process that we see the Trojan horse acting out in its role within this myth. That the horse itself deposits not a brood into the uterus of Leda, but a body of soldiers onto the soil of Troy. And once birthed, just as you may see from Leda's children, these soldiers wreak havoc and they take over the city. The body of soldiers leaping out of the Trojan horse onto the soil of Troy is an alternate interpretation that these lines may possess. The reframe and the syntax both fit the description of the scene as Yeats gives it, as well as adhering to the mythic events that relate to the myth of Leda. The shudder that we're speaking of occurs when the trap door is slid from somewhere in the loins of the Trojan horse and the soldiers begin to stir inside of it. The first quarter instinctive interpretation, the physical, carnal one, interprets loins to be more specific in referring to the groin of, say, Leda or Zeus. However, the definition of loin is quite varied, and there are several definitions that adhere to it. And there's even one when speaking about animals. And so, for instance, the loin of a horse wraps from its spine all the way around its belly. And so when speaking about a horse and using the word loin, you would imagine something different than what you would if you were to say it in reference to a human. And so this is one of those points of definition where I have been challenged on whether or not I was adhering to the text itself accurately. And so I just want to point out, the sophistication and the depth of the word loin, its vast history, and the diverse uses that it finds, not only, when describing humans, but also when describing other animals, and particularly horses. And so I just point that out to help the listener better visualize, where on the Trojan horse this trapdoor may have been. And again, this is all theoretical, and so there's no, necessarily, right or wrong answer when imagining this. You just sort of take the facts that are here and you sort of try to build the image or the story with those facts. And that's all I mean to do by pointing out the area on the horse that is considered the loins, just to sort of help you start to build this text world better so that you can see what's actually going on inside this burning city. It's quite an exercise, but it's one that's worth it and almost necessary to appreciate the depth of artistry in works like these. If we wish to describe the body of the poem in strictly poetic terms, that is the 6.5 lines in the middle of the poem that is separated by stanza breaks both on top and on bottom. If we were to describe it poetically, we would say that the first 4 lines form a quatrain, and the remaining 3 lines form a tercet. And so now, by reassigning the line which said, "A shudder in the loins engenders there," by reassigning that to the visual of the Trojan horse and the soldiers stirring within it, and then breaking out to set fire to the tower and to raise the city, we can now begin to see all 3 lines in that tercet reinterpreted to the Trojan scene. So whereas before, scholars and critics and readers, at most, had only reinterpreted the broken wall, the burning roof and tower, now we are able to take another step back, which is "a shudder in the loins engenders there," and we are able to reframe it and reassign it to the Trojan text world. And now our image of that scene, the one that sort of suggested itself with Agamemnon's name and the description of the burning city, that scene is now added to with this great new image of the Trojan horse and the soldiers emerging from it to burn the place. But does the reframing stop there? Or does it continue up into the first 4 lines of the body? If we could reframe one additional line, maybe it's possible to reassign the others. Our success this far suggests that we should continue. So we will. Before beginning the analysis of the rest of the body of the poem for an alternate interpretation, we should just take a look at it. Take a look at how Yeats put together some of these lines and thoughts. Take a look at how he punctuated them. One particular punctuation I wish to point out occurs at the end of line 8. It is a semicolon. And line 8 is right up against the tercet, which we have now fully reframed. By using a semicolon in this particular place, Yeats is suggesting that these 2 sentences or thoughts are related. One is a close continuation of the other, so close that it's worth pointing out with a semicolon. And so this unique fact makes me wonder if the reframed interpretation, the Trojan scene that we have sort of unearthed and built here, if it does not also have some association with the first 4 lines, it is hinged to, if you will, with a semicolon. And so, with that interesting fact pointed out, we'll dive into the first 4 and see what we might unearth. Extending the Trojan scene into the first 4 lines of the body is possible only with the greatest effort. And I say that because you must make a conscious choice, a resistance to the inclination to allow the myth that you originally walked into the poem learning or even thinking, to resist that interpretation. Because now that it is there, and you may or may not have imagined this assault, it will be just as important that you get away from it. For only if you do that can you have hope of reinterpreting these 4 lines. You have to be objective. And so, the beginning of the body reads, "How can those vague, terrified fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies?" Once again. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body, laid in that white rush, but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? The interpretation of the first quarter indicates that the fingers belong to Leda as she fends off the swan. Upon a more objective analysis, however, these fingers appear to belong less specifically to Leda. You see, Yeats uses the personal possessive pronoun, her, at the end of the thought, rather than the beginning. Now this is a poor piece of grammar, unless, of course, you're doing it intentionally, to hide something or to suggest something. And why I say it's a poor piece of grammar is because in the thought, how can those vague, terrified fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? By putting her at the end rather than the beginning where the fingers are mentioned, how can those terrified, vague fingers? By putting it at the end, it leaves the fingers unknown. Whose are they? I mean, you can sort of claim that there's a suggestion, of course they're Leda's. It's about her, right? But there's no specific indicator that these fingers are Leda's. And it's because Yeats put the personal possessive pronoun at the end of the thought, where it attached only specifically to thighs, so that the thighs are feminine, her thighs. But the fingers are those fingers. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? So you see, if he would have put the her at the beginning and said, how can her terrified, vague fingers push? Then you would have known who the fingers belong to. But he didn't do this. And so oftentimes, as we've seen before, when he dropped Agamemnon's name into the middle of the poem, he decides to manipulate his pronoun and article usage and neutrality to obscure his meaning and grant readers a greater meaning, so long as they could seek through the fog to find the greater truth that is sometimes hidden in multiple meanings. And so, first, you must detach all the different elements and characters within these 4 lines. You need to know exactly how they come apart and what belongs to what has a specific connection. For instance, her thighs. The one absolute connection there is that the thighs in question are feminine. Those fingers. The absolute fact about that association is that there's no specific indicator whose fingers these are. So you know right away not to attach them to, say, Leda or the swan too quickly, because you're going to need to do some investigation. So with the fingers separated from the feminine thighs, we take the lines again and we ask ourselves, how can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? And so again, remember at this point to keep your mind packed with the Trojan scene, with the war unfolding, with the myth immediately surrounding it, the soldiers hidden in the distance behind an island, waiting for the signal to swoop back around and take them by the surprise. So put it all in the front of your mind. The soldiers within the horse, waiting, stressing, sweating, wondering if they were going to be discovered. The people, the drunken revelries that are going on within the city as they think they have won the war and the enemy has left. And then ask yourself again, what's going on here? In the tercet, we brought ourselves all the way back to the Trojan horse and the trap door being dislodged from its loins and the body of soldiers being deposited onto the soil. And so, being that this was our last sort of event in our text world that we've built here, the Trojan text world, let's sit there with that horse closely in mind and ask ourselves again, how can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs? And how can body laid in that white rush but feel the strange heart beating where it lies? As an adjective, feathered amplifies the word glory. Now, the meaning of feathered can go a lot of different ways. If you'll take a look in the dictionary, it has more than one meaning. And whereas some words have similar definitions, there are other words that have just completely opposite definitions. And so feathered is one of them. And in fact, in the field of carpentry, feathered oftentimes is used to refer to a way that joints are overlapped and or interlocking. And so it is a carpentry term as well as an adjective that could describe a bird. With Homer describing the Trojan horse as being wooden, as readers and artists and people who are just curious, we can think about this Trojan horse, this wooden Trojan horse that was built with a trap door. And we know that for sure as well. Homer records it, and so does Virgil. And so how was this door concealed? And how was it concealed in such a way that when given a signal, they could get it open? It must have been a fine construction. And that trap door, no doubt, would have had to have been concealed with some type of overlapping material or seamless joint membership. And so in fact, when we think about the Trojan horse, the trap door is its feathered glory. That trap door of the Trojan horse is the hinge of the greatest epic works in Western civilization. Homer's Iliad and Virgil's Aeneid. Where the Iliad ends off, which is the destruction of Troy, the Aeneid picks up. For the Aeneid are the Trojan people now fleeing their destroyed city, looking for a new land. So the crux point between those two stories is the success of the trap door on the Trojan horse. If the trap door didn't succeed in its concealment, or if the Trojans simply rammed their spears dead through it and set it ablaze, Homer would have never written his epic, and neither would Virgil have had to record the woes of the Trojans. The trap door and its success is its glory. For without it, it would have been a fancy casket rolled into enemy territory. But it wasn't. Its designer possessed some genius to create such a concealment that the enemy would overlook it. It's also worth noting that in Yeats' poem Wild Swans at Cool, where he in fact describes swans in the context of his philosophy of gyres and spirals and the cycle of civilization, he puts these ideas together poetically in his poem The Wild Swans at Cool. In that description, he also tells us that swans are known to build their nests among the rushes. Now here he doesn't say white rush as he does in Leda, but it verifies the fact that in Yeats' mind, he knew or imagined swans nesting within this rush, the same rush that would have been everywhere on the coastal plain of Ionia as the encampment sat outside the walls of Troy. So no doubt an available resource for the builders of the Trojan horse.